Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see many faces I recognize coming into the room. Welcome, everybody. We'll just give it a few seconds for everyone to arrive. We've had many more people register for this event than we were anticipating, which is really exciting. And we do have a really packed calendar today to get through, and we hope that we will manage to get through it all. But you're all very welcome, and it's great to see everybody here. On the screen at the moment, there are a couple of questions for you as everybody starts to arrive to reflect on yourselves. And if you would like to, please do feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. So what brought you here today to this webinar? Why is this of interest particularly to you? And what is important for you at the moment in the context of place-based community-led regeneration? What's alive for you? What are the potentials you're working with? What are the challenges that you are thinking about at the moment? I see we've still got people coming in. So we'll give it a couple more seconds only. So yeah, do feel free, those of you who are just arriving, to have a think about the questions that you're seeing on the screen, and I invite you, if you feel called, to pop into the chat some of your thoughts on those questions. So what brought you here today? Why is this particularly of interest, and what is important for you right now in the context of place-based community-led regeneration? Welcome, Hajar. So great to see so many people here that are interested in this subject, which is our work. So in the interests of time, because we do have quite a lot to get through today, welcome to this presentation, and I hope if we can squeeze in some time, the start of a wider discussion about the contents of the report that we produced for Joseph Rowntree Foundation on the enabling conditions for place-based community-led regeneration. So in a second, I'll go over the agenda and what is coming up in the next couple of hours. I'll introduce the team who carried out the research, and I will invite Sophia Parker, who's the Director of Emerging Futures team at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, to say a couple of words. But first, while we're waiting for everybody to arrive, and we recognise that many people today will be coming and going over the next couple of hours. Some people will join later, and some of you will have to leave before the end. The whole of this meeting is being recorded and will be released after the Global Majority Sister webinar, which takes place next week, along with the full report. So there are a couple of questions to those of you just coming in on the screen in front of you. It's regenerative practice to start any meeting with a wake-up question that brings us into focus and presence for what we are going to discuss and work on. And these are ours for you. So what brought you here today? If you feel called to put something into the chat, why is this of interest to you? And what is really important for you in the context of place-based regeneration at the moment? And first, there is, of course, a whole lot of complexity behind the words in the title, place-based, community-led and regeneration. But for the purposes of today, we are thinking about place as any form of regenerative work that takes place across from the bioregional level to the neighbourhood level. through rural, through city, and through smaller landscapes, but also from systems like food, like education. And community is the whole living system in that context that comes together to work on anything in co-creation. And regeneration is that which creates the conditions conducive to life, the enabling conditions for regeneration that we're going to look at today. And there's a whole lot of unpacking we could do on that. And in some of our regenerative learning journeys, we do that over 12 months, but we've only got 2 hours today. So we're going to focus on the report. Here, oh, nope, I've gone backwards instead of forwards. Here's what's coming up in a minute, an introduction from Sophia. Josie is going to look at the brief for the work, and then we are going to talk about the patterns that we saw, which we would describe as opportunities for islands of coherence. Dimity, who's part of our team, will talk through the trajectory of change that we think that might enable and how that might play out. And then we will look at opportunities for the philanthropic field and again, a trajectory of change. We hope to have some breakouts towards the end so that you can discuss together and think about and share what we see. And at the end of 2 hours, we will harvest and close the session today. We hope we will get through all of that, and we recognize that it is a great deal. So Sophia, I'm just going to invite you now, if you would like, to share a few words about why Joseph Rowntree Foundation commissioned this research. Let's see if we can spotlight you. There you are. Welcome.
Hi everybody, it's lovely to see so many of you here today, and I'll just very briefly say a couple of words about why JRF commissioned this piece of work. Really happy to see it reaching out into the field today, and our interest is really in understanding the conditions that are needed for transformative place-based change to take hold. And by that, I guess we mean a kind of shift towards regenerative futures, better, more beautiful futures for people and planet, and futures that are really rooted in healing those stories of separation and stories of scarcity that underpin this kind of somewhat toxic model of late-stage industrial capitalism we find ourselves in. And what I really love about the report, and I won't spoil too many of the findings that are going to be shared, but the thing I really love is that as well as thinking about the enabling conditions that are needed for that kind of scale of change to take place, the kind of more material, tangible conditions, I think this work really highlights some of the more invisible conditions that are also needed, the capacities and inner resources within ourselves, the quality of the relationships, the resourcing and processes of learning and unlearning that are needed. And I think for me, as a person working in a philanthropic organisation, it really is a call to arms to funders like Joseph Rowntree Foundation to say, how are we going to fund that critical, invisible, less tangible work that seems to be so important to this kind of change? So yeah, that was our interest, and I won't say any more for now other than to say a huge thank you to Jenny and the team behind the work. They've done an enormous amount, have gone way above and beyond, and yeah, really looking forward to having this conversation with all of you today.
Thanks ever so much, Sophia. Right, let me see if I ought to by now be able to completely master technology, but I fear it will never be my forte. Okay, so here is the core team that presented this research. For those of you who don't know Really Regenerative, we're a small community interest company dedicated to enabling the conditions in place for regeneration to occur, and we work from a bioregional level down to the neighbourhood level. We have 3 areas of work: our educational and learning programs, our work with place-based projects, which is both in the UK, in Europe, in Asia and in South America, and our provocations and research work, of which this project is one of those. So this is myself, Josie Wharton, and Maria Camilla Carrascal, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. And in this project, we partnered with Regen Labs based in Australia. And you'll hear from Dr. Dimity Podger, who has been an enormous support to us. And it was a great collaboration between both organisations, and really important to us to bring multiple different organizations into this work rather than work alone. Regeneration is definitely not work that should be done alone. It is a collective and co-creative endeavor. I'm just going to ask Josie to talk just for a second to the design and the main inquiry and some of the limitations of our work.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So yeah, we were guided by 2 research questions for this work. So you can see them on the screen there. Firstly, what conditions and capacities enable communities to steward holistic regenerative transformation of their places at the level, longevity and depth required by the polycrisis? There's obviously quite a lot in that question, but we were trying to kind of cover that scope that Sophia introduced so beautifully then. And then secondly, how as a philanthropic organisation might Joseph Rowntree Foundation play the most catalytic role in accelerating regenerative place-based transformation? And so for the purposes of this report, we were thinking about JRF, but actually also this very much applies to the wider field of philanthropy. So through this conversation today, we're thinking about how this applies much more widely than to one organisation. The methodology we used for the report was a series of semi-structured interviews. So we spoke to over 45 organisations who are working in place. That was across 5 different continents and across a range of the fractals and scales of place. So we were trying to get that diversity of different organisations to talk to. We additionally interviewed around a dozen organisations working in finance that are related to this place-based work. The interviews were then coded and analysed for the patterns that we saw arising, and we'll introduce those in a moment. Of course, there are quite a few limitations to a piece of work like this. We had a limited number of interviews, even though we tried to cover a broad range of organisations and places, and therefore we aren't saying this is wholly representative of what is out there, but hopefully gives a good overview of the different kinds of initiatives that are working in this space. When we collected the data, we worked only through the interview, so we didn't do the next layer of talking to or kind of exploring what the interviewee's context specifically was. So we were working, on the responses that we heard from the interviewees, and in that context, we recognised that the kind of applicability may not always be transferable from place to place. Because we know that the kind of regenerative work is very context driven, but we wanted to do is get a snapshot of what is happening across the different spaces. When you're going to then think about how you might apply this in your own place, it's important to think about how the context that you're in might change those findings. That's to give you an overview of the methodology that we used.
Thanks, Josie. So I'm going to start with a number of different patterns that we saw emerging from those conversations that we held. And I hope that some of you will be familiar with Ilya Prigozhin's, I'm never sure how to entirely pronounce that properly, Nobel Prize-winning chemist's work that describes creating islands of coherence. That when systems that are moving away from equilibrium, as the systems that we are all living amongst are doing at the moment, small islands in a sea of chaos have the capacity to shift the entire system to a higher order. And to say a little bit more about what he was talking about then, they are to a certain extent places where individuals, fields of endeavour with shared intention can come together. They may be physical spaces, they may be intangible spaces, but they represent emerging ideas of stability, purpose, and interconnectedness. And one of the important patterns that we saw, which was supplemented by, I guess, my own research of the last 10 years, is something that we would describe as centres for life. So what are centres for life? They are diverse types of organisations. They're phenomena that can be described as social movements, but they're also physical realities in place. You can think of them as containers that hold, support, and develop transformative capacity and capability for systems evolution. You can think of them as holding spaces for a process by which new vitality, new viability is added to any system. And to give concrete examples, perhaps from the past, you could think of them as being things like the cafes of the Enlightenment period. They might be similar to the Baptist churches that supported the civil rights movement in the US, or the folk schools that helped the Nordic countries in the transformation from poor agrarian economies to modern social democracies in the early 20th century. So they act as convening agents for multiple stakeholders to come together, and they're sites where experimentation, dialogue, and innovation takes place. And one of the functions that they have is to create greater capacity in any system, to be centers for learning and development and experimentation, which are then pushed back out into a wider system to enable conditions for change to take place. They showed up diversely in this study as multiple different clusters within which potential was held that could act as enabling factors for place-based community-led regeneration. They showed up as bioregional learning centers and communities of practice. They showed up as regenerative innovation centers that were raising funding and holding the space for place-sourced enterprise, regenerative enterprise to develop. They showed up as innovation centers for specific areas, specific systems of learning and transformation. That might have been food, that might have been the built environment. And they showed up as field building initiatives from diverse social movements, but also again within the built environment, within diverse experiments that are starting to show up in the way in which co-living, community-governed housing is combined with local material sourcing. There are many different ways in which they started to appear and show up. Some of the examples that we talked about, that we spoke to, included Atelier Luma in Arles. And if Jan is with us, I'm going to invite him in a second from Atelier Luma to speak to that project. As widely geographically diverse as in India and Australia, Regen Labs, who are our partner in this study, is also a really good example of an island of coherence that's working in bringing regenerative enterprise together in one place. Bioregional projects like Bioregional Asia, Costa Rica Regenerativa, Cascadia in the US, Monviso Institute in Italy, but also in philanthropic organizations like Thousand Currents, who are in the US, who are shifting a lot of their funding towards focusing on social movements. Do we have Jan? Are you with us? Are you within the group that has arrived from?
I did see him join, and now I don't see him in the list. So maybe he's had a challenge, but I'll let you know when he joins again, Jenny.
Thanks, Dimity. No worries. I always prefer to invite somebody who's been a participant in the study to talk about their own work rather than me speaking about it. But for those of you who are not familiar with it, Atelier Luma is a project in Arles in France that is wholly funded by a philanthropic individual, Maya Hoffman, who is from the region, who saw an opportunity to acquire and convert a large former series of Victorian buildings that once housed manufacturing of railway engines, and create a materials culture that has been designed over the last 12 years to enable experiments from all over the world into the design of a biomaterials-based culture in the region that is the Camargue. it is a really good example of work in place to create a physical renovation program of significant architectural construction, not just as a base for learning about how to transition a place-based economy towards a biomaterials base, but also as a living system of potential, and demonstrating a deep commitment to understanding how materiality may play a role in our relationship to materiality in this transition. It's a remarkable example of the fusion of different practices. And one of the underlying questions that we were looking at in this research, in addition to the two larger questions, was, is it important that place-based community-led regeneration projects are enabled across culture, economy, and ecology? And Atelier Luma is one of the examples that suggests that even though this work can take place across different fractals of place, from bioregion to the neighborhood, that the capacity to engage with both culture, our living systems, our ecology, and economic work is really important for longevity and growth of the regenerative field over time. I'm just going to ask Dimity to speak about the work of Regen Labs, because that is another really good example of a Centre for Life that is focusing primarily on economics, but weaving in culture and ecology too. Dimity.
Thanks, Jenny. Nice to be here with you all. Yes, Regen Labs, and it's really interesting to think of it as a centre. And we work in different regional places in Australia, really focused on catalysing the shift to regenerative economies. And so growing and convening relationships with regenerative enterprises, as well as funders in place, as well as other ecosystem partners, particularly local government. And so bringing together in place to kind of, what are the aspirations for regeneration? How might enterprise be a way of catalysing that change? How might they work together to have even greater impact with the right support, and then also the right finance? And how can we connect those places from one state to another state to another state, so there can be learning across those different convened, I guess, centres and nodes of change. Is that sufficient, Jenny? You're on mute.
Oops, sorry. Yes, that's great, Dimity. Thank you very much. I would encourage everybody, just in case we do not get time to go out into breakout groups during this session, please put any questions that you have for us in the chat. If we don't manage to answer all of the questions that you have today, we will come back to you and answer all of those questions where we are able to over the next week or so. Josie, I'm going to invite you to look at the next pattern that we saw that we felt that was significant.
Thanks, Jenny. So this pattern is around place readiness. So place readiness determines that the appropriate scale and character of the regenerative intervention that appears. And by place readiness, we mean the conditions present in any place. So this is across all different scales that influence the character, the type, the scale, and the potential success of regenerative activity that might emerge. So you could also use the term cultural scaffolding for this kind of work too. And we have identified a range of kind of priming conditions which appear to contribute to the place readiness for regenerative works to happen. And you can see on the right of the screen here a model which Jenny has developed through her work, which isn't as linear as it looks, but actually shows the different kinds of levels or layers of readiness in place for regenerative working. I'm not going to go into sort of detail around that now, but just to flag that is in the report, and it kind of informed our way of looking at this idea of place readiness in the work. And so all places, whether we're looking at this or not, have kind of priming conditions which change and evolve over time. which may or may not enable regenerative working, but we saw that there are some conditions that we think support work, and which came up repeatedly in the conversations that we had. So a couple of examples of these are things like traumatic events in a place, so wildfires or flooding that have previously happened and have enabled the community to come together around a particular need, or the presence of cultural or entrepreneurial hubs, such as the one that Jenny just previously mentioned. There are priming conditions like these that we found kept coming up and that seem to be important for regenerative working. And then from these priming conditions, we saw that successful interventions were really responding to the particular characteristics of their place. And what was arising from that was the one thing that suited that place most particularly. And we thought this was important to note because we shouldn't automatically think that there is a particular kind of quote best way of doing this kind of regenerative intervention. It needs to be really driven by the place that it is in and responding to those particular priming conditions. But on the screen now, you can see kind of clusters of things that influenced and responded to place readiness that we think are important for regeneration. So firstly was this point around the capacity to respond and discern the degree of place readiness in that area. So we found that the people in the place who were able to spot that and identify what was right for a place was really important. This involved the kind of time and investment spent in capacity building, which often is quite a significant amount to develop this and to build it over time. There was a need for the capacity of place-based anchor organisations to engage and respond to this work. So this is, for example, things like local authorities or councils. And there was a high degree of importance in donor and funder education to be able to understand and engage in this kind of work too. We also noted that a plurality of approaches present was important. So this meant there were a number of different initiatives or priming conditions that had come together for this work to emerge. And then also there was something around the density of regenerative practitioners. So there's a density or a number of people working in this space who were able to come together and convene and build those priming conditions into the kind of regenerative working. So to give you a brief example of this, one of the organisations we looked at was Regenerate Cascadia, who work in the Cascadia bioregion in the northwest of the coast of America and Canada. And this is a social movement and a regenerative capacity building organisation who are developing a vision and framework to administer a regenerative fund to kind of build on this work for Cascadia.
I'm listening to you and listening to them.
This particular organisation builds actually on decades of activism, of research and community organisation in this large region. And they noted that the character of the work that they are developing today can only really have arisen for the socio-political and the geographical and geological even conditions in that particular place. So it was really interesting to see how this organisation had built on the priming conditions that were right for them. And we found that what worked for this organisation was quite different to other parts of the world and other organisations that we spoke to. So that's the kind of role of the priming conditions and place readiness for what is it that should emerge in a particular place. I'll hand back to you, Jenny. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Josie. Sorry, I always forget to unmute myself. It's worth saying that for this study, we were looking very much outside of the UK, and the work to consider how this relates to the UK is work that is currently ongoing. But for those of you who are from the UK on this webinar, those place-based priming conditions can be seen across the UK in many different areas and regions. Many of you may be familiar with work that is ongoing in Totnes, where over time the presence of organisations like Schumacher College, sadly now transforming to a different form, the work of transition towns, and now the work of the Bioregional Learning Centre in the South Hams in Devon have all contributed to creating priming conditions for regenerative work in that particular area. Other organisations that would fall into that kind of description might be the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, or places in Scotland like Findhorn, for example. So those are just simple examples that I can speak to coming from a UK context. So the third pillar, or the third sort of core pattern that we looked at, is really about both capacity and capabilities. And in different geographies and in different places, it was clear that there are widespread regenerative capacity and capabilities, but that there are also significant gaps in different places. And naturally, they are different from geography to geography, culture to culture. And what we noted is the deep complexity that working with complex adaptive systems or deep systemic evolutionary work requires a phenomenal amount of unlearning and new learning to enable the conditions for place-based regeneration to unfold. And having a really deep understanding of culture, economy, and ecology, but also a multiplicity of capabilities are essential. They are both skills, they are knowledge areas, but they are fundamentally about adopting different, very different living systems mindset. The report contains really deep focus and a list of all of those different skills, capabilities, and capacities that we noticed, some of which you can see on the screen. But just briefly, we noted that some projects, some work had more and some had less deep ecological knowledge and understanding. Some had more or less capability to work with pattern literacy. Some had more or less strategic capability to work with evolving systems. Some had more or less capability to identify the critical nodes in systems within which they could work for change. There was widespread difference across finance, governance, and economic literacy and how to create new structures and conditions to support the emergence of a regenerative world. And there were differences in the ability to work with consistently and hold a living systems mind and the capacity to design for evolution. Again, also the ability to work with economy, ecology, and culture was different across the different levels of projects that we looked at. And critically important, I think there were gaps in the ability to engage whole systems, to stay in right relationship, to know and understand and embody what right relationship might be in any given place, and to develop the long-term relational engagement processes that are necessary for deep transformative work. And some of the ways and projects within which this showed up really well, Resilience Earth is a community-based, also bioregional project in Spain, bioregional weaving labs in the EU that you may know. And there were many more projects than we are listing here. But some of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure designs in these organizations really supported capacity building over time. So Resilience Earth, for example, is a project where organizations that join Resilience Earth, the community, have 2 years in which to build their capability and their capacity in regenerative design and culture before they become full members of the organization. Within bioregional weaving labs, there is consistent regenerative resourcing and support for teams that are working so that they can, over time, build up their own capacities and capabilities in this work. And what showed up in this study is the fundamental need and necessities for these social infrastructures in capacity building as part of these types of works. Josie.
Thanks. So the this pattern I'm sure will be familiar to lots of you on the call today, which is the importance of place-centric individuals and organisations who have trusted relationships in being able to do this work. So by place centricity, we were talking about people who showed deep commitment and connection to a place. And this came up as being really vital to all the organisations we talked to. And these people played many kinds of roles within that work. And some of them you can see on the screen there, a role as educator, as convener, innovators, those who are kind of acting as lighthouses for what could happen in the future, where we could be moving towards, and as acting as kind of embodied examples of what that future could look like. And we heard from the interviews that this field has really been nurtured and developed by individuals across all these different places around the world, often using their own resources, their own influences and connections, sometimes for decades, to build up this work in place. And being of a place or embedded within it with a really proven track record of trust and integrity and working for the good of a place with a strong kind of reputation was really, really a strong indicator of success for initiating this regenerative work. There are different ways that this was expressed in the interviews. So, for example, there are individuals who are born into a place and have a very long-term connection to it, and often with kind of sizable funds or resources to be able to invest personally. And Jenny gave the example of Atelier Luma previously with such a person who was able to kind of give that long-term investment. There are also individuals who have long-term connections, influence, trust, and respect within a particular place, and are able to leverage that to generate the opportunities and identify and kind of leverage the potential that they see in a place. But we also heard there are lots of individuals who are coming from kind of outside of that particular place, but who have spent time in developing connections, building trust and influence and respect within that place. And this, we heard particularly, this takes a lot of time, and there is opportunity for that to be disrupted over time, which can be a challenge. But that kind of investment in a place is really critical. And there are then organizations and individuals who are maybe outside of a place, but who really embed themselves in a place with the attitude to kind of serve and develop what is already existing and amplifying the potential of that particular place. And we didn't find that any of these were particularly better than others. And in fact, a number of organizations had people who are playing a mix of these different roles and who had come from these different perspectives. And one example of that is Earthshala, which is an organization in Bihar in India, which promotes rural development through a very holistic approach that addresses food security, financial resilience, individual empowerment, community empowerment, and the focus on kind of climate change and biodiversity as well. And this organization has 3 different individuals who are working as founders. So firstly, one who grew up in Bihar and who is very, very familiar with the place. He has a deep lived experience of that place, its culture, its economy, and its ecology, which really enables the kind of strong connections and informs the vision for the work. And then 2 other founders, one who is from another region in India, and a third who is from America, but who has spent a lot of time in the region. And they find that together as a team, they're able to work very closely to build this holistic view, which both has the kind of deep lived local knowledge, but also a kind of outside perspective from both a sort of regional and national view, but also this international perspective. And they felt very strongly that those different roles that they played and those different kind of perspectives on place were really critical to the success of their work.
Thanks, Josie. I hope Sophia won't mind, and any funders won't mind if I mention how what was also really apparent about place-based individuals, pioneer species, we might call them, is how very many that we interviewed and many that we don't really, they are critically important to opening up the field in the place in which they work for regeneration, and how very many of them were absolutely, utterly exhausted and burned out, more with the challenge of constantly trying to secure funding for this work. And we know it's really incredibly difficult. All philanthropic organizations are absolutely snowed with asks. And it's extremely difficult to support and fund individuals in this way. But there is no question that in the seeding and development of a new field of energy in place, that these individuals really played a critical role in many places. So for the final core pillar or core pattern that we saw is related to the capacity building pillar, but specifically focuses on the complexity of humans and our capacity to relate to one another and to be in right relationship with one another. And by developmental work, we mean the intentional and consistent building of a living systems mindset and a regenerative culture. So another way of thinking about that would be to consider any group of stakeholders that come together in a co-creative endeavor in our culture. Even in a group of 10, 12 people, you will have different worldviews. You will have different cultural backgrounds. You will have different life experiences, which particularly are not often visible and on view. And you'll have different characters and personalities. And mostly within our culture, we focused on the latter. And like life, we are gradually becoming much more complex as a species, and navigating that complexity requires processes that successfully manage that complexity. And what we saw in this study was that those projects which incorporated processes to manage and to deal with cultural human complexity had much more longevity. They were much more able to get over the relational rocks in the road that could otherwise have derailed their work, and that the approaches that they used were highly diverse, from forms of coaching that we would call regenerative resourcing to innovative governance models, from processes like sociocracy, regenerative development and design, community engagement processes. There was not one way that was more effective than others, or that people that we spoke to expressed as being more effective than others. And of particular interest, although we didn't have the capacity to go deeply into any of these observations, was that in many of the projects with longevity and impact, there was a high degree of neurodiversity present in some cases. And those projects that had a high degree of trauma-informed process managed that complexity really well. So the correlation of this work with longevity of projects, diverse approaches are valid and helpful, trauma-informed neurodiverse literacy being present, but also the democratization of access to regenerative capacity in the wider field was also important and noted. It does differ across different geographies and cultures, but as a pattern where it was present, it had a significantly different effect. And that work, I'll skip across this slide a little bit in the interest of time, works on multiple levels. So it is the inner, the self, the developmental work, the work within a team or a community or a place or a stakeholder group, but also the ability to do that developmental work across a system, which was often carried out through the vehicle of a Centre for Life as embodied in developmental work. I spoke earlier about the 2-year onboarding apprenticeship for organisations to join Resilience Earth Network, but another process, an interview that we spoke to, was the project that's called Amazon Sacred Headwaters, that some of you may have seen was part of the Earthshot Prize last year. And because this is embodied Indigenous wisdoms, it probably won't surprise you to know that time and the time to work on relational processes in this project was really critically important. So across the multiple different tribes that came together to work on this project, they spent 2 years in relational inquiry about how to create a bioregional strategy, and then a further 2 years to actually work on that strategy together. And in our fast-paced, quick, sharp, staccato, can we make a decision, let's go now world, time and the investment in time and relationship is critical showed up as critical in the study in doing regenerative work. It's also true within the context of an EU project within the new European Bauhaus programme that we worked on over the last 2 years called Desire, that when we were enabled to embed a process that in Really Regenerative we refer to as relationship before task, across how the project worked, and now across all new European Bauhaus projects, we were able to go significantly deeper and more intensively into the actual project work when we got there. So there is, in terms of what showed up in this study, a really strong indication that weaving in this kind of developmental infrastructure and social infrastructure is really important in the work. So I'm going to invite Dimity now. At the end of looking at those core patterns, of which there's much more depth in the actual report, what we tried to look at is what might that look like over time? How might a philanthropic organisation support place-based organisations embed some of these ideas and patterns over time in this incredibly complicated slide that I'm hopefully going to be able to zero in on as Dimity speaks to it.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm happy to share the other thing, but this is good. You can actually, everyone else can zoom in as well with their mouse pad. We wanted to map how might the patterns be reflected in a trajectory of change or a transition. And we found the X-curve as a really useful lens to use to think about at what points might you invest in certain interventions, or at what point might you be looking to build up the right dynamics and really support the conditions and capacities to grow for regeneration in places in different ways, as well as how might you consciously close out practices and create the conditions for the shift, so that breakdown of current system to allow for this kind of new set of conditions to grow. So we mapped the different pillars and recommendations across the X-curve here. There are a couple of areas that I wanted to highlight for you, and just you'll see what is mapped here and what Josie and Jenny have just shared. And in particular, in the area of educating and nurturing, which is in this build-up dynamic, you'll see here, set up the opportunity of a learning fund to really democratize education for people who are ready to learn and act. So how are we developing capabilities in places, in many places, and how do you fund that work? One of the things we did find was that people were self-educating, and we need to be able to accelerate the level of capability. You'll also see in the nourishing area, really intentionally seeking out and investing in place pioneers, which was a really important pattern. Who are these individuals who are working in place and at scale, and to provide that kind of long-term freedom and confidence to continue in the work. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next section about how might that funding look, what have we learned from funders. And if we move up into sort of this integration or activation phase of change, you can sort of look at the scale up aspects of scaling up experimentation, acceleration, and emergence from this early build-up phase into integration. And based on what we had learned and heard from the 45 sort of initiatives that we looked at, the opportunity to invest in supporting communities to cross-pollinate and share what they're learning and share different approaches and patterns, not necessarily in a direct replication, but in a way of, we've learned this, you know, what can you implement in your place and in your area, and also in that area is supporting councils also in say the UK context, but in other places that some of you are joining from. How might they become learners in this process? So if you're educating and nurturing in that build-up dynamics, how are you educating and nurturing across the system with regenerators, as well as funders, as well as council, as well as community organisations, and then accelerate that kind of learning system in that scale-up phase. And if you see in the breakdown dynamics kind of trajectory, really this early point of signalling change. So whether it's JRF or other philanthropic organisations, how can they become centres of regenerative learning, particularly in the philanthropic space, in how they work to develop decolonized funding approaches and place-based approaches, and how can they really signal that change and be part of creating that authorizing environment to support the kinds of funding needed to then move into that scale-up phase. So those are a couple of patterns and how we've thought to map these. An X curve is really in response to the dynamics in your own context. So you might look at some of these interventions in the report and place them in different areas on an X curve or a trajectory of change for your own place, and this is where they seem to be placed when looking at the whole report and looking at the pool of initiatives that we were able to interview and research. So I might hand it back to you now, Jenny. So this one is around advancing conditions and capacities for place-based community-led regeneration. And the next X curve I'll share with you is really around that shifting of finance and funding as another way of mapping patterns and opportunities for intervention. Thanks, Jenny.
Dimity, thank you very much. I'm sure everybody can probably see from the complexity on this slide that there is a lot more in this report than that we can communicate in 1 to 2 hours, but we will send out the full report to everybody who's attended, and you'll have plenty of time to dive into all of the key points that are, I think, ideally summarized on this X curve. It's a great way to actually look at how any philanthropic funder can invest in whether that's breakdown dynamics or build up new dynamics and scaling out dynamics of creating and enabling a new system to emerge. So that we're doing quite well on time, which is a minor miracle, considering how much we've packed into this report. But that sort of brings us. Sorry. Oh no, I'm hearing somebody. I hope everybody else is not hearing that same voice as me. But this is a sort of moment where we thought, if we had, for example, just 10 minutes to pop out into small breakout groups, perhaps of 4 people, and then come back and drop some reflections into the chat, just to explore what in your context reflects these patterns. How are they showing up? Do they resonate for you? Are these patterns that you have seen that are important in your place? And what are the gaps or potentials you're identifying in your context from these insights? We have just about 10 minutes to do that. So it's also our tradition in regenerative practice when we're going out into small groups to meet individuals that we haven't met before, particularly in conditions like this where we have a very short period of time, not to waste any of that on introducing ourselves by name, rank and number, because that sets up the conditions of labeling and othering from the start. So if I could encourage you all, when you arrive in your small groups, just to dive straight into these 2 questions. Or it may be that as you do that, you're completely flummoxed by the amount of information that we have shared with you. But it's really important to us that as a field, we start to reflect, if we can, however brief the opportunity is, to think about what we've shared and how collectively we might be able to build on and activate some of these insights. So team, if we are ready, with breakout rooms, because I have naughtily not attended to it.
I'm ready. Shall I press go?
Yeah, press go. Let's go.
Have fun. The
Enjoy.
questions.
We'll see you in 10 minutes. Is it working?
People are gradually joining their rooms.
They're disappearing. So it is working. It's a miracle.
If people are away from their desk, they may not have joined, but we're good, I think. Did you want to join a room? Good.
No, I just...
All right. Do you want to put the timer on, or do you want me to do time?
No timer's on. I cannot
Okay.
that you're all back.
I think everyone should be back now.
Yeah, kind of serves you right. You really should focus and pay attention to what's happening on the screen in front of you. It's always too short a time, I know, to have these conversations. But whatever came up for you, if there's something that you would like to drop into the chat, we will produce a summary of the chat that we will share. And there were some really deeply interesting questions in the chat that we may get time for when we arrive at the end, like, you know, what level of place are we talking about? Does density of population have any aspect? Could we hear more about the design of the 2-year apprenticeship? What is the pathway for funding energy transition in place? And what is the capacity for funding, particularly for building up what could be described as commercial acumen and understanding of what a regenerative economy might look like and what that transition is. And I would love to be able to debate and discuss all of those really important questions. In the time we have today, we may not get to many of those, if any of them at all. But one of the things that we hope to do with this piece of work is find a way to organise, perhaps in the future, and anybody who has any ideas of how this might well be done, small in-person roundtable meetings and gatherings to really dive into more of the detail in the report in deeper discussions that hopefully result in further funding coming into the field and also more action being taken. So we're now sort of a bit more than halfway through this webinar, and we are going to sort of turn our attention to our recommendations for the philanthropic field, not just for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but for the field as a whole. And it won't surprise you, given some of the patterns that we've seen, to find that these recommendations reflect a lot of those patterns. But I suppose there is something, core patterns to think about that were reflected really, really widely, and that we've probably inelegantly described as shifting the field from drip feed to flow, and from sticking plaster to system, and from short to long term. I'm not sure that the sticking plaster to system is particularly elegant way of describing the patterns that we think that were expressed as needed and necessary. And certainly most of the people that we spoke to expressed a view that philanthropic investment in many cases sometimes can act as a handbrake on the enabling conditions for place-based regeneration. And I think we always have to be fair to philanthropic organizations that are inundated with the tsunami of need at the moment, that even with all of the funding that is in the philanthropic field, can never respond to. And it's a real challenge to focus and decide on what you focus your efforts. It's been under huge pressure to meet a demand it can almost never meet, for what I think deep ecologist Joanna Macy describes as protect and preserve, which is supporting the people and places that have been hurt and damaged by our current system, which is effectively the sticking plasters on the wounds that are bleeding from upstream systemic causes. And it's also sometimes been about trying to spread too little butter over too much toast. So overall, there's a pattern to be navigated that could move philanthropic funding from drip feed to flow. And that is not to ignore the very perilous, hard and challenging decisions that might have to come with that. One of our interviewees, Laura Ortiz Montemayor from Mexico, who has recently hosted a systemic investing gathering for South America, described it like this: the flow of water creates thriving life. It's the lifeblood of the planet. The currents, rivers and streams are the arteries that carry its life around the planet. And when that flow is blocked, pooled or dammed, the landscape starved of what it needs to create the conditions conducive to life. It's like a blood clot that causes heart attacks. Money needs to flow like water to rehydrate the landscape, and the accumulation of capital in a few hands is stopping economic prosperity for everyone. So how do we metamorphosize money like water? How do we recognize, this is a translation from Spanish, so I think it's a little unkind. How do we recognize that philanthropy may have in some instances been a block, and how can we think about it as a more, moving in a more distributed way? The analogy was very much the soil is like our bank, and it's been one of the most generous banks in history. It's distributed by design and nourishing by design. So how do we make the bank called philanthropy more like soil? How do we allow it to help us be more like beavers, the architects of the watershed? And I think that's a really interesting, in many ways, beautiful question for us all to hold. So I'm sure you won't be surprised to see that one of the recommendations that we made is to think about how we can transition philanthropic funding towards developing regenerative centres, what we call centres for life, whether that is biomaterials-based economic development. It might be projects focused on marine regeneration, cultural regeneration, focused at a bioregional level, but essentially creating those containers that can support and enable systemic evolution and systemic change. and focus investment on social movements that are specifically focused on regenerative work and bringing a regenerative future into being. You know, and the work of identifying what those centres for life and what those opportunities might be is underway and is emergent. But there are some lighthouse projects that are already emerging. Where I live in Sussex, we have a project emerging called the Sussex Bay, but that we also thought the place-based anchor institutions that exist that were largely designed and constituted not for regenerative culture, like museums, like private estates, like mayoral development authorities and national parks, could play a significant role in partnering with philanthropic funding to enable those centres for life, or to even become those centres for life themselves. And in particular, in the case of museums, museums are amazing organisations at holding space for cultural exploration and inquiry, but also narrative. So all of those place-based anchor institutions could potentially themselves be transformed into centres for life with the right mindset and the right type of funding. The second area that we looked at, which has an enormous amount of complexity in it, is how can we allow more philanthropic funding to be directed towards enabling those invisible patterns that are hard to see, the cultural scaffolding. Can we make regenerative design development and systems evolution education more readily available, for example, to the place-based leadership of those anchor institutions? If we are to bring system as usual with us, and there is an enormous discussion in there around, do we accept collapse? Do we design for collapse? Or do we design for transition of existing systems? The importance of building political will, which is really absent in many places when it comes to regeneration. And some of the projects that had really successfully engaged with both regional and national political entities were seeing the enabling conditions increase in their regions. How to invest in what we might describe as acupuncture moments, how to see the moments where investing, for example, behind a law on ecocide might be valuable. A real deep need to invest in building narrative capacity, the desire to have specific funds for narrative development, including film, podcasting, long form, and inquiry, and more regenerative research of this kind. I think I saw Daniel Christian Wahl, if you're still here, if you could just, for example, say a couple of words. I know a project that you and I spoke about in terms of film has taken a really long time in the build. Are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry to call on you. That was a bit mean.
Yeah, I mean, that project evolved over 15 years. A group of Argentinian initially advert creators, so working for large companies, doing short video adverts, were on a course of Gaia Education's designing EDE, Eco Village Design Education program, which I held here in 2011. And they had the idea of turning that into a film, and then life happened. And then the pandemic happened, and somehow we reconnected and wove some of the work in my book into it, and also the Greta Thunberg story and all sorts of things. And it's now come out as 7-part documentary in Argentinian television called The Impossible Future. I'll put the link to the website in the bottom. And it's looking for ways of bringing it into other languages at the moment. Yeah, one example of how these projects can take 15 years, but eventually do happen.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Sorry to call on you like that. What was really consistent across all geographies and all types of project was that almost the last thing that regenerative place-based projects invested in was narrative and telling the story of what they had been doing and how they had been doing it. And when you consider how incredibly strong any dominant culture's hold on the avenues for narrative are, it felt like a really important particular thing to be investing in the future. Another field that of investment potential is really continuing to foster a deep understanding of actual how transformative change happens and therefore how it should be funded. And then perhaps finally, although there were many more points than this around enabling the cultural scaffolding needed, the real importance of investing in and including the contribution made by cultural art, dialogue and inquiry-led practice. From projects at the neighbourhood level, like Float in Australia, all the way through to some of the more successful bioregional projects that we looked at, had absolutely incorporated cultural practice, art, dialogue, and embodied work into their process. Josie.
Thanks, Jenny. And this will come as no surprise, I think, from the conversation that we had a bit earlier about the importance in investing in the place-based pioneers doing the work. We heard earlier about the kind of challenges we heard across all of our interviews, really about the pressure that people are feeling and the level of burnout and the level of kind of personal resource and time that people have had to put into this work over years. And so we feel like it's incredibly important to invest in these place-based pioneers and really to invest over the long term and kind of at the scale and commensurate with the need that is really there. So a large focus is really thinking about the longevity of investment. A lot of organisations, as we've heard, were focused on kind of short-term project-by-project funding. And so being able to shift this, if we're thinking about that kind of drip feed to flow irrigation of funding, shifting from that project-by-project model into something which is much more about the longevity and scale, talking maybe sort of 10 years, decades of investment into these place-based pioneers and organisations to ensure that the work that they really want to be doing and that the investment is there to support that work. And this is again a shift from maybe thinking about the kind of restricted place project funding that we often see in philanthropy into that which is much more unrestricted, much more able to kind of be responsive to the potential that is emerging in a place, which again we know requires a change in the dialogue between funding from philanthropy and organisations, but which we can also see has happened in some places where there is that recognition that the kind of longer term and unrestricted work needs to happen over time, and building that trust between those parties. We also recognise that this needs to involve kind of testing new place-based financial governance models, and we heard for the example of the idea of regenerative guilds or place-based community funding, that where the governance is really developed and supported and sort of moved into more of a community space. So the flow of funding is not so much top down, but is also thinking about how it can be, the decision making can happen more in that kind of place-based model, so that the kind of knowledge of the local need and local capacity sits where the funding is being delivered from, as opposed to being separated from it, which is what we have heard happens quite a lot at the moment. And then finally, Jenny talked there about the importance of developing centres and investing in either new or also building on existing ones. So we also felt there is an important recommendation around funding, kind of seeking out pioneers who are doing that work or who are capable of doing that work in place, in order to support them to develop this kind of practice of centres, because that the kind of need of people in that place is to understand that capacity and that knowledge in that place, and kind of seeking those people out rather than just waiting for funding applications to come in. It feels like also an important shift in the dynamic. And we recognise that this this is a kind of shift in the relationship between funders and those who they are investing in. But the importance here is really shifting from that kind of drip feed to that flow funding, and recognizing the importance in investing what it actually costs to do this work, because we've seen so much of this is kind of goes unfunded or is additional that people are providing themselves, and kind of bringing that back up to the funding level is really important.
Thanks, Josie, and also the recognition that came through in the interviews that it requires a degree of privilege to be able to put yourself in a position where you are as an individual, networking and weaving and creating and building these fields. And so there's a really important point about democratizing the capacity to do that work as well, I think, that came up. We are seeing across private investment, a lot of our conversations that we had were with family funds and private investment. And since we did this work last year, I have seen an increasing number of private funding systemic gatherings convened, not least of which was this one that's on screen last week in London. I also referred to the SVX gathering that was sponsored by Laura Ortiz Montemayor in Mexico. So we are seeing private a trend in private funds within the intergenerational wealth transfer that is starting to happen, where there is a deep desire and interest in bringing private funding into the systemic field. But we also heard that there is a deep desire within place-based community-led work for philanthropic organizations to also act as centers to influence the type of funding going into this work. So that there is a potential to play for philanthropic organizations, not just JRF, who do phenomenal work in convening dialogue and discussions in this field, to convene dialogues perhaps between family offices, private funding, and how philanthropy can add value with the experience that and different approach that philanthropic organizations have had, that there is enormous potential for philanthropy to step up and cross-pollinate with private investment, whether we call it blended finance, but also in more visionary potential projects. Josie.
Thanks. And then there is an important focus here, which Jenny alluded to just now, around strengthening and democratizing access to regenerative practice. So we heard from our interviewees that the journeys that many of them have gone on have really included significant time and investment that they have made themselves in learning, education, and in continuing kind of participation in this field and communities of practice. And that regenerative learning is a very poorly funded part of the regenerative field. So many people have self-funded this work, and there is a need for a greater access, and particularly, as Jenny was just saying, to ensure that actually a diverse range of practitioners from all backgrounds can be involved in this work. We need all of those different perspectives to be involved for this work to really take off and to really have the impact of the potential that it has. At the moment, we really definitely heard that it's a case of people who can afford to kind of engage and invest in themselves in kind of regenerative practice learning, other people who are getting it, and actually there is a real need to invest more broadly so that a wider range of people can access the kind of learning that's needed in this space. So this could include actions like investing in learning funds for community-led place-based projects. It could involve supporting particular kinds of practices like biomimicry or reconciliation practices, which are very useful to this kind of work. And particularly investing in kind of learning across those three pivotal fields that we've flagged up earlier around ecology, economy, and cultural or social scaffolding work. And we also particularly heard actually that there was a need for a special emphasis on building ecological capability of all of those three kind of pillars that we heard. Generally, it was the ecological capability that organizations or individuals felt that they were lacking within themselves or within their organization. So there is a real need for that support to be more widespread and more available. So broadly speaking, we found that there were kind of three different needs of capacity building, which I think are on the next slide. So firstly, there's developmental capacity. So this is capacity, as Jenny talked about earlier, around the sort of developmental working in this space. So the capacity for seeing and being involved in ontological shifts, in deveiling practices, and a kind of deep understanding of regenerative thinking, systems, systemic approaches, and a real focus on the third horizon. So there is a need for support and learning around this space. There is also support need for investment around functional capacity. So these are the kind of skills, practices, approaches that support action, including things like enterprise design, experimental design, participatory processes, but also more kind of traditional business practices around being able to look for investment, being able to design your organization well. Those are kind of very important practices and capacities that are needed within the field. And then there are also very visible gaps around capability, including things like pattern literacy, and as I just mentioned, the kind of ecological literacy as well. And then the final area is relational capacity. So this is the ability to be kind of in and maintain that right relationship with others and with the place that you're working. So that community relationship development, which can be improved and strengthened through things like pro-social work or peacemaking practices, trauma-informed design, reconciliation processes. All of these are kind of practices that would be useful to invest in order for this wider field to be able to kind of grow and get the kind of access to the learning and development that is needed for it to kind of really flourish.
Thanks, Josie. I think it's probably worth saying that there were in several interviews, a phrase was used that even though we might struggle with resourcing in terms of finance, even though we might struggle with lack of capability in practices, what often brought projects down was the inability in relational practice, which was both interesting, I think, and also significant for us to think about. Finally, coming towards the end of this report, that what was very apparent to us was that there is a perceived and probably real perception of a capability, ambition, even an understanding gap between private finance, so family offices, private investment, coming into the regenerative field, and place-based, community-led regenerative work that could be filled through philanthropic investment and effort. That private capital was beginning to be really interested in long-term, low-return, systemic transformative work, but that their perception was place-based, community-led regenerative work did not match the ambition in terms of scale linking portfolios. So, for example, the ability to bring different bioregional projects together that were focusing perhaps on different levels of systems change across different geographies around the world, or different city-based regenerative projects to co-create and collaborate together, that there was a deep desire to try to upskill and expand the ambition of place-based community-led regeneration to meet the perhaps emanating from business as usual understanding of private finance and regeneration that is, I think, a significant gap that could be worked on over a number of years with philanthropic intent and effort. So ways of convening constellations of philanthropy, family offices to explore collaborative potential to scale link different place-based regenerative projects that are bubbling up now at a much more significant system-oriented level. And to support organizations that, by building innovative regenerative finance and strategic capability within place-based projects, to actually meet that gap of private finance coming into the field. We didn't have the ability to go deeply into that, but it did show up as an area of real potential for the philanthropic field to engage in a convening role to accelerate philanthropic capacity to influence this field of work. Dimity, I'm going to hand back to you for one last X-curve.
Thanks, Jenny. So we're looking, this X-curve really maps sort of breakdown and build up dynamics to scale up and phase out around the shifting finance area towards being more catalytic of place-based change. And there are a couple of things I wanted to highlight. In that early phase of breakdown at the top, we talked about how there could be stronger investment in fostering a deeper understanding of how transformative work should be funded. And that shift in, rather than being mission-oriented necessarily from or strategy-oriented from a philanthropic perspective, to being much more responsive to place and community-led regeneration and aspiration and challenges. So unlearning and relearning how, the strategy or the theory of change for philanthropy. And then when you're looking across to the top right around stabilizing that, thinking about communities are the vision and strategy holders of philanthropy rather than philanthropy being the strategic holders. So I think that's one shift that we're looking at here. If we look at the build-up dynamics in the early part, that innovation space, that early experimentation innovation, we really do highlight how catalytic it could be to engage foundations in collaborative experiments and really increase that quantity of catalytic capital that can be moving through to place-based initiatives, and having experiments that can then, as you move through this dynamic of this transition through to scale up, to really be moving into scaling those innovations in finance, if you're thinking about that backing and influence aspect of the X-curve. In the capability space, in the build-up dynamic, yes, definitely spending time, with regenerative learning for decision makers, investing in the capability development of decision makers in traditional governance roles, so that they can be in that authorizing environment and really understand this real need to shift economic and social development to being one of regenerative development rather than business as usual. And aligned with that, building capability with community funds, trusts, foundations around the opportunity for using their corpus. And so experimentation could be done in that area. It's an experience that we're having in the Australian context of foundations, family offices, private investors, putting a portion of their corpus towards this idea of catalytic investment, investment in more regenerative initiatives and enterprises in their local places that are more place-based or place-sourced initiatives. I think, in the practices receding space, in that phasing out area, loud and clear that came through the report is really shifting from that drip irrigation approach of philanthropic funding to really take the handbrake off pioneers and regenerative initiatives in place, and also really shifting to, particularly in a place level, moving beyond competitive grant making to one that is more collective and cooperative in a place, is a really important shift and a practice that needs to, that competitive grant kind of context to shift away from. Those are a couple, Jenny, within that, those dynamics on this, the way of mapping the findings in this way.
We're doing well on time, so if you wanted to highlight a couple more, Dimity, I think on these X-curve is contained a potential trajectory for transformation and change. We realize that it is extrapolated and proposed from a very small study, and there are no guarantees or any ideas that what is represented in these X-curves is a given or a must, but it was a way of trying to capture the very many different potential ideas that came up in the interviews that we held. So for example, one idea is that philanthropy could play a significant role as interim guarantor of local mutuals, for example, or place-based approaches to funding regeneration. There's an enormous amount of different ideas and concepts shared within it, which we hope everybody will be able to reflect on at their leisure. But Dimity, was there anything else that you really felt was very important to highlight while we have a small amount of time?
Thanks, Jenny. I think what's coming up for me is you can be at different parts of the spectrum, whether it's in breakdown or scale up within your own organization and in your place, and what's needed is going to be context specific. I think there's some really interesting things happening in the build-up dynamics, and it seems to be, how do we move from this build-up, experimentation, acceleration, to actually starting to scale up different examples, and the opportunity for large foundations like JRF and others in different parts of the world to really signal that shift and get behind some of those innovations, perhaps from smaller foundations or finance innovation happening in place. So I think that's an important piece of how do we move beyond emergence and into maturing some of these different innovations, and the role of philanthropy in kind of making that journey. There's some wonderful examples from the Australian context, just to sort of share here in this innovation space, where community foundations are providing voucher systems direct to local food systems wanting to provide affordable, nutritious food locally, particularly in communities that are experiencing poverty or have food desert kind of contexts, and this capacity of foundations to provide sort of support through direct vouchers to those food enterprises, food hubs, to really provide an uplift so that they can scale. So foundations and philanthropy can really provide that guarantor and de-risk place investments. Another way can be particularly around place assets that communities really need to provide essential services in their contexts, and how can philanthropy provide a backing of those assets and go together and partner more. So I think collaboration is definitely one of those growing capacities that's really needed in making this shift.
Thank you, Dimity. We're coming towards the top of the hour and we don't have 20 minutes left for dialogue. So I wonder if I could encourage everybody that is still with us in open forum here or in the chat to share with us, what did you hear that you want to learn more about? How do you think this research could help or inform you in your work? And what opportunities do you see for building on and socializing this research in a way? We could probably do just about 10 minutes in a breakout if we are ready to go again. I know it's always too short, and my apologies for that, but we're really grateful that you've already taken 2 hours out of your day to join us. So if we're ready, let's just do 10 minutes on those questions. What did you hear that you want to learn more about? What opportunities do you see for building on and socializing this research? What more would you like from us as Really Regenerative, Regen Labs and JRF? How much more can we utilize this work to help you? So if we're ready to go, let's just do 10 minutes. That would be great. Done.
I'm just moving a few people around because they're on their own.
Recording.
Oh no, well done.
Welcome back, everybody.
I know that was too short, but I hope nevertheless that you had some useful and valuable connective time and conversations out there. We are now coming towards the end of today.
Not everyone's back.
Oh, not everyone's back? Okay.
I think we've got a stream coming in now. The waterfall's happening.
Our from drip feed to flow is happening as we speak. It is alive and well in this discussion. Has everyone flowed back into the room now? Okay, we have abandoned drip feed for flow, which is what we like. There's just a couple of minutes to thank all of you for hanging with us for 2 hours and coming in and out and listening to what we had to say. There's a huge amount more detail and many different layers in the report. But also, really importantly, deep gratitude from us to everybody who contributed their knowledge, their time, their wisdom, their experience to this work. It was absolutely joyous to listen to the very many uplifting and hopeful and positive stories of this work going on in different places around the world. Deep thanks, particularly to Joseph Rowntree Foundation for their ongoing vision for commissioning this work and supporting us through it. I want to say a special vote of thanks to my team, to Josie, who's joined us today from maternity leave and has a beautiful boy who was born in the middle of this work that we love, to Dimity for joining us from the middle of the night in Australia, which I will be reciprocating next week and joining the Australian, New Zealand, India and Asian crew in the middle of the night. Also a vote of thanks to, if you have appreciated the many beautiful images, and there are many more that are in the report, to the wonderful Niels de Visser, who has done a lot of the graphic design for this project. We were talking whilst you were out in the group about the importance of culture and art and visuals. It's not easy to find somebody who can visualize systemic evolution, but Niels is wonderful in that work. So to everybody who has participated today and everybody who participated in the work, deep gratitude and thanks from Really Regenerative. And to close on some very practical notes, here's where you can connect with us. There's my email, Josie's email, and Dimity's email address, my phone number too, because I'm kind of old school and actually really like talking to people on my phone if anyone wants to call us. We'll be publishing the full report and the recordings after the Global Majority webinar, which is next week. And we'll share these slides with you if you would like to see them. These are turbulent, transformative, really, really difficult times. But they are also uplifting and hopeful too. And we really hope that participating in these 2 hours has given you some insights and hopeful ideas that you can take forward and that we can all take forward as a field of endeavour into the future, with more co-creative collaboration and definitely more flow, which we love. And thank you again, all of you, for joining us today, from Dimity, myself, and from Josie, and from Sophia, who's really kindly taken 2 hours out of her frantically busy day with a to-do list that is as long as a toilet roll, for joining us, and all of you today. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the day. Please do be in touch with any ideas or thoughts. We look forward to hearing from all of you. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you soon.
So much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.